"Which of my girls would you like?" the father asked. And in front of the whole saloon, one man stunned the crowd when he said, "I want the fat one." The room went silent. Laughter turned cruel. A daughter, long mocked and unwanted, stood trembling in the snow, until a scarred stranger threw his coat around her shoulders and claimed her with dignity. But this wasn't just a rescue. It was the beginning of a storm. The town whispered, the railroad circled like vultures, and her own father plotted to tear her away. Behind the laughter lay betrayal. Behind the land lay a hidden truth that could destroy everything or save them both. A woman who had been shamed all her life is about to prove her worth. A man who swore never to love again is forced to fight for more than just his land. When the world calls her the useless one, will she rise to become the strongest of them all? Drop a comment below and share which part of the world you're tuning in from today. If you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe for more. The bitter Colorado wind howled through the settlement's main street, driving needles of sleet against weathered wooden buildings. Townsfolk huddled close to the saloon's warmth, their breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The glow from oil lamps spilled onto the muddy street, casting long shadows across faces reddened by cold and whiskey. James May, a rancher whose desperate eyes matched his threadbare coat, stumbled forward with 3 young women in tow. His daughters clung together like frightened deer, their thin shawls offering little protection against the cruel weather. The eldest 2 were slim and fair, but Susan, the middle daughter, was heavy-set with downcast eyes that spoke of years of shame. "Got me some fine girls here," May bellowed, swaying slightly as he grabbed Susan's arm. "Who'll give me a fair price? Bank's breathing down my neck, and these girls need husbands anyway." His words slurred together, colored by the whiskey on his breath. The crowd pressed closer, their initial shock giving way to cruel amusement. Susan felt her cheeks burn as rough laughter erupted from the gathering. A weather-beaten cowhand pointed at her, nudging his companion. "Reckon that, big one, could feed a man through winter." More laughter followed, sharp as the sleet pelting their faces. Susan's younger sister whimpered, and she instinctively pulled the girl closer, trying to shield her from both cold and mockery. Their father's grip tightened on Susan's arm, making her wince. "Come now," May cajoled the crowd, his desperation showing through his drunken bravado. "My youngest here's a pretty little thing. Surely one of you fine gentlemen." "How much for the fat one?" A deep voice cut through the jeering like an axe through ice. The crowd parted, revealing a giant of a man standing in their midst. Susan had seen him before. Everyone knew of Noel Boone, the mountain man who lived up in the high country. Scars crossed his weathered face, and his beard was shot through with gray, but his eyes were clear and steady as they met hers. May's lip curled. "Which of my girls would you like?" he sneered, already turning to present his youngest daughter. "I want the fat one," Boone repeated, his voice quiet but firm as mountain stone. A collective gasp rose from the onlookers, followed by a silence as sharp as the winter wind. Susan's heart hammered against her ribs. She'd heard tales of Boone, how he'd survived alone in the wilderness for years after losing his wife, how he could track a wolf through a blizzard, how he never spoke unless he had something worth saying. Now those steady eyes were fixed on her, seeing past her size to something else, something she herself had almost forgotten was there. Without taking his eyes from Susan's face, Boone reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch. The coins inside clinked as he tossed it to May. "That's $200. More than fair." Before May could respond, Boone shrugged off his heavy buffalo coat and stepped forward. Susan flinched, expecting. She wasn't sure what, but his movements were gentle as he wrapped the warm coat around her shoulders. The fur collar still held his body heat, and the familiar scent of wood smoke and leather enveloped her. "Sir," she whispered, her voice trembling, "you don't have to." "I reckon I do," he replied just as quietly. His rough hands carefully fastened the coat's wooden toggles. No one should be standing in this cold without proper covering. The crowd stood frozen as if witnessing something they couldn't quite comprehend. May stared at the money pouch in his hand, then at his daughter, now wrapped in the mountain man's coat. His face twisted with a mixture of shame and relief. "Well?" Boone's voice carried across the suddenly silent street. "Do we have a deal?" May nodded jerkily, unable to meet anyone's eyes. "She's yours then." He stuffed the pouch into his pocket and turned away, pulling his other daughters with him. Susan watched them go, her heart aching for her sisters. But something else stirred in her chest, something that felt surprisingly like hope. Boone turned to her, his massive frame blocking the worst of the wind. "There's a wagon waiting," he said softly. "Got blankets and hot bricks for your feet. If you'll come with me?" Susan looked up at him, really looked at him for the first time. His face was harsh with years of sun and wind, but his eyes were kind. More than kind. They held respect. Something she hadn't seen directed her way in longer than she could remember. Why, she found herself asking. Why choose me when everyone else... Because, he interrupted gently, I've seen you at church, mending clothes for Widow Johnson's children. Seen you sharing your bread with that Miller boy when his pa was laid up. Watched you tend sick folks during the fever last spring when others wouldn't go near. He paused, then added simply, "A woman's worth isn't measured in pounds, Miss May. It's measured in kindness, in strength, in faith. And by those measures, you're worth more than any dowry." Tears froze on Susan's cheeks as she nodded, unable to speak. Boone offered his arm, and she took it, feeling the solid strength of him. Together they walked away from the saloon, away from the stunned onlookers, away from years of mockery and shame. True to his word, a wagon waited around the corner, its bed lined with thick quilts and warming bricks wrapped in flannel. Boone helped her up with surprising grace for such a large man, making sure she was settled before climbing up himself. As they drove through the swirling snow, Susan clutched his coat closer, breathing in its wild, honest scent. For the first time in years, she felt something unfamiliar settling in her chest. Dignity. This scarred giant of a man had really seen her when everyone else looked away. He had wrapped her in warmth when others offered only cold mockery. The wind still howled, but within the shelter of Boone's coat and quiet strength, Susan felt the first stirrings of spring in her heart. Whatever tomorrow might bring, this moment, this choice, had changed everything. Not just for her, but for the man beside her who had turned an auction into an affirmation, transforming her deepest shame into unexpected grace. The wagon rattled on through the storm, carrying them away from the settlement's judgmental eyes and toward whatever future God had in mind for this most unlikely pair. Susan found herself praying, not for deliverance from this strange situation, but in gratitude for the mysterious ways the Lord worked, even through bitter winter storms and the quiet courage of a mountain man who saw value where others saw only size. The stunned silence lasted only moments before someone in the crowd barked out a harsh laugh. Like a dam breaking, the sound unleashed a flood of cruel mockery that echoed off the saloon's wooden walls. "Looks like the mountain man's gone soft in the head," someone shouted. Others joined in, their voices carrying over the howling wind. "Reckon he needs her to keep his bed warm through winter. She'll eat him out of house and home before spring." And Susan's shoulders trembled beneath Noel's coat, but she kept her chin up, though tears threatened to spill. She'd endured their taunts before, but now they seemed sharper, aimed at both her and the quiet giant beside her. Her father's face twisted into an ugly sneer as he stepped forward, whiskey courage making him bold. "Now wait just a minute," he slurred, eyeing the coin purse in his hand. "How do I know you can provide for her? Ain't right, selling my girl to some squatter who might not even have a proper roof over his head." Noel's expression didn't change, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. Without a word, he reached into his vest and pulled out a folded paper. The crowd pressed closer as he set it deliberately on the saloon table, spreading it flat with one scarred hand. "A homestead deed," he said simply, his deep voice carrying over the wind. 300 acres up Shadow Creek Way, with a cabin and good water rights. His eyes met Susan's, gentle despite his stern expression. "If you choose to stay, Miss May, you'd be co-owner. Equal partner in everything." Susan blinked rapidly, scarcely believing her ears. Co-owner? Equal partner? Such words had never been spoken to her before. Her father had always treated her like a burden, her size a constant source of shame and ridicule. As if reading her thoughts, her father spat into the snow. "Co-owner?" he sneered. "What good would she be on a homestead? Can't even fit behind a plow proper. Been nothing but a drain on my store since she was 12. The crowd's laughter grew louder, meaner. Someone made a crude gesture about Susan's size. Another mimicked her walking, exaggerating every movement. The familiar shame washed over her, but something else burned alongside it now. Anger, and beneath that a flicker of hope she hardly dared name. Noel's hand settled on her shoulder, warm and steady through the thick coat. He didn't speak, didn't need to. His quiet presence was like a wall between her and their cruelty, solid as the mountains themselves. The jeering reached a fever pitch when suddenly hoofbeats pounded through the storm. The crowd parted as a horse and rider burst into their midst, snow coating both man and beast. Deputy James Rowe swung down from his saddle, his face grim beneath his snow-crusted hat. "Mr. Boone," he called out, pulling a paper from inside his coat. "Got some business with you." The deputy's arrival shifted the mood like a change in the wind. The laughter died down as he unfolded the warrant, though Susan's father continued to smirk, swaying slightly where he stood. "By order of the Territorial Court," Rowe read aloud, his voice carrying clear despite the storm, "Noel Boone is hereby accused of unlawful squatting on land now claimed by the Western Pacific Railroad Company. All structures and improvements are to be—" "Railroad land?" someone interrupted. "That whole stretch up Shadow Creek?" The crowd's mockery found a new target. "Not so high and mighty now, are you, mountain man? Ain't even his land to offer." Susan's father pushed forward, his face flushed with drink and vindictive pleasure. "There you have it. Trying to trick my girl with worthless paper. She'll be ruined along with you, living in a stolen cabin until the railroad burns it down." Susan felt Noel's hand tighten slightly on her shoulder, though his face remained impassive. Deputy Rowe looked between them, genuine regret in his eyes. "I'm sorry, Boone," he said quietly. "Papers came down from Denver this morning. Railroads claiming everything from the creek to the ridgeline." Noel nodded once, as if this was nothing more than a minor inconvenience. "Much obliged for the warning, Deputy." His voice was steady as he turned to Susan. "The choice is still yours, Miss May. I won't blame you if you'd rather stay." Susan looked around at the familiar faces of the settlement, faces that had mocked her all her life, that now sneered at both her and this quiet man who had offered her dignity along with his coat. She looked at her father, still clutching the coin purse, already turning away as if she was nothing more than a failed transaction. The wind cut through the crowd, driving icy needles of sleet against their faces. Susan drew Noel's coat tighter around her shoulders and met his eyes. "I'll go with you, Mr. Boone." A murmur ran through the onlookers. Her father spat again and stumbled away, muttering curses about ungrateful daughters. The deputy touched his hat brim in silent acknowledgement as Noel led Susan through the parting crowd. His horse stood patiently at the hitching post, steam rising from its flanks. Without ceremony, Noel cupped his hands to make a step for her. Susan hesitated only a moment before placing her boot in his palms. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, helping her settle sideways in the saddle, arranging her skirts and his coat to protect her from the worst of the weather. The crowd had followed them, still calling out insults and predictions of doom, but their voices seemed distant now, muffled by the falling snow. Noel swung up behind her with practiced ease, gathering the reins in one hand while the other steadied her waist. "Hold tight," he murmured, and Susan gripped the saddle horn as they turned away from the settlement's gleaming lanterns. The horse picked its way carefully through the deepening snow, each step taking them further from everything Susan had known. Behind them, raucous laughter still echoed from the saloon, carried on the bitter wind along with the last words she would hear from her father. Good riddance to bad weight. But Susan barely heard them now. Her world had narrowed to the steady rhythm of the horse's hooves, the solid presence of the man behind her, and the strange, wild hope blooming in her chest despite the railroad's threats hanging over them. Through the swirling snow, she caught glimpses of distant mountains rising like shadows against the storm-dark sky. Somewhere up there, a cabin waited, and whatever else might come, she had chosen this path for herself. The settlement's lanterns grew smaller behind them, flickering like fallen stars in the gathering dusk. The wind moaned through bare branches, carrying the promise of more snow. But within the shelter of Noel's coat and quiet strength, Susan felt warmer than she had in years. Together they rode into the heart of the storm, leaving behind a chorus of mockery but carrying with them something far more precious. The first fragile seeds of dignity, respect, and perhaps even something more. The snowfall grew heavier as Noel guided his horse north along the wagon road. Susan could feel the powerful animal laboring beneath them, its hooves breaking through the deepening drifts with determined steps. The bitter wind cut across the open plain, but wrapped in Noel's heavy coat, she found herself surprisingly warm despite the weather. Susan twisted in the saddle, watching the settlement's lights grow dimmer through the curtain of white. Each flicker seemed to mock her still, reminding her of the cruel laughter and her father's final curse. The memory made her shoulders tense, and she felt Noel shift slightly behind her, giving her more space without removing his steadying hand from her waist. The silence between them stretched like the snow-covered road ahead, broken only by the rhythmic crunch of hooves and the horse's heavy breathing. Questions churned in Susan's mind, but one burned brighter than all the others. Finally, gathering her courage, she spoke. "Mr. Boone?" Her voice trembled, barely louder than the wind. Why did you choose me?" The man behind her was quiet for so long she wondered if he'd heard her at all. When he finally spoke, his deep voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Because you're worth more than they ever saw," he said simply. "More than your father could understand, selling his own daughters like cattle." There was an edge of controlled anger in his words. "No person deserves that kind of shame, least of all you." Susan blinked rapidly, glad he couldn't see her face. Such plain-spoken defense of her worth struck deeper than any sermon she'd ever heard. She wanted to thank him, but the words stuck in her throat, too big and too raw to voice aloud. Hours passed in companionable silence. The horse plodded steadily onward as the afternoon light began to fade. Noel kept one hand on the reins while the other remained a steady presence at Susan's waist, helping her balance when the horse navigated particularly deep drifts. Despite the uncertainty ahead, she found herself relaxing gradually into the rhythm of their shared journey. "There," Noel said suddenly, making her start. His arm extended past her shoulder, pointing toward the west. "See those peaks? My cabin sits in a protected valley just below the tree line. Good water, good hunting. Enough timber and grazing land to make a proper go of it." He paused, then added quietly, "If we can hold it against the railroad's claims." Susan studied the mountains rising like shadows through the swirling snow. They looked wild and beautiful, and more than a little frightening, much like the future stretching before her. But something in Noel's voice when he spoke of his land made her think of the word home in a way she never had before. As true night began to fall, Noel guided them into a grove of towering pines. The trees broke the worst of the wind, their branches heavy with snow. Near the back of the grove, a natural overhang of rock created a sheltered space where the ground remained relatively dry. "We'll camp here," Noel announced, swinging down from the saddle. He reached up to help Susan dismount, his huge hands gentle as he lifted her down. "Storm's getting worse. Better to wait it out than risk the horse in the dark." Susan stood awkwardly, stamping her feet to restore feeling, as Noel efficiently cared for his horse. He removed the saddle, rubbed the animal down with handfuls of pine needles, and draped a blanket over its broad back. Within minutes, he had a small fire crackling beneath the rock overhang, the flames casting dancing shadows on the stone above. "Ain't much," he said gruffly, pulling a battered tin pot from his saddlebags. "Just beans. Was only planning on being in town long enough to file some papers with the land office." He looked genuinely apologetic as he set the pot in the coals. "Should have brought better provisions knowing you'd be coming along." "Please don't apologize," Susan said quickly. "I'm grateful for anything." She meant it too. The simple smell of warming beans made her realize she hadn't eaten since morning. Too nervous about her father's schemes to manage breakfast. Noel dished up a generous portion into a tin cup and handed it to her along with a spoon. Their fingers brushed briefly during the exchange, and Susan felt a flash of warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. She ate carefully, savoring each bite, while Noel took his own portion and settled on the other side of the flames. The food was plain but hot, and as Susan ate, she found herself studying her companion in the firelight. Noel's face was weathered, marked with old scars that spoke of a hard life in the wilderness. Yet there was something gentle in the way he moved, something careful and deliberate that made her feel safer than she had in years. When they finished eating, Noel wordlessly handed her a heavy blanket. Susan wrapped it around herself, Noel's coat still draped over her shoulders beneath it. The fire's warmth and the day's emotional exhaustion began to take their toll, making her eyelids heavy. Before sleep could claim her, Susan clasped her hands together beneath the blanket. "Dear Lord," she whispered, her voice barely a breath. "I don't understand your ways, but could this man be my deliverance? After so many years of shame and hurt, could this truly be your path for me?" She paused, listening to the pop and crackle of the fire. "Please help me trust, and help me be worthy of the dignity he's shown me. Amen." Through half-closed eyes, she watched Noel settle himself against the rock wall, his rifle laid across his knees. The firelight caught on the snowflakes settling in his dark beard, making them glitter like stars. His eyes remained alert, scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of warmth, a guardian shadow keeping watch through the long night ahead. The sound of the wind in the pines became a lullaby, and the last thing Susan saw before drifting off was Noel adding another log to the fire, his movements careful and quiet so as not to disturb her rest. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she fell asleep feeling truly safe. Morning light filtered through the pine boughs, casting dappled shadows on the fresh snow. The storm had eased overnight, leaving behind a pristine blanket of white that sparkled in the dawn. Susan woke to find Noel already tending the fire, a pot of coffee brewing among the coals. "Storm's past," he said, nodding toward the lightening sky. "Should make it to the cabin before midday if you're ready to ride." Susan nodded, pulling Noel's coat tighter around her shoulders. After a simple breakfast of jerky and the last of yesterday's coffee, they mounted up. The horse seemed eager to move, its breath steaming in the cold morning air as Noel guided them out of the sheltered grove. The world looked different in the clear light. Snow-covered peaks rose majestically before them, their slopes dotted with dark patches of pine and spruce. As they climbed steadily higher, Susan found herself mesmerized by the untamed beauty of the landscape. This was nothing like the dusty settlement below. This was wild country, where a person might carve out their own destiny. Near mid-morning, Noel reined the horse to a stop at the crest of a gentle rise. "There," he said quietly, pointing to a protected valley below. "That's home." Susan's breath caught at the sight. A stout log cabin nestled against a rocky ridge, partially sheltered by towering pines. Thin wisps of smoke curled from the stone chimney, dancing against the backdrop of snow-covered mountains. A rough-built barn stood nearby, and Susan could make out the dark lines of split-rail fencing stretching across the valley floor. "Someone's there," she said, noting the smoke. "Neighbor boy," Noel explained. "Tommy Whitaker. Keeps an eye on things when I'm away. Brings in firewood. Checks the stock." He clicked his tongue, urging the horse forward. "Good kid. Family homesteads about 3 miles east." As they drew closer, Susan could better appreciate the cabin's sturdy construction. The logs were thick and well-fitted, the roof solid, with cedar shakes weighted down by heavy stones. It wasn't fancy, but it spoke of careful craftsmanship and attention to detail. A gangly youth of perhaps 15 winters burst from the cabin door as they approached, waving enthusiastically. "Mr. Boone, you're back early!" His eyes widened when he spotted Susan, and he quickly snatched off his wool cap. "Ma'am." "Tommy," Noel acknowledged, dismounting. He helped Susan down before turning to the boy. "Much obliged for watching things." "No trouble at all," Tommy replied, still stealing curious glances at Susan. "Got the stove going nice and warm inside. Left some fresh eggs from our hens too, like Ma said to." "Thank your mother for me," Noel said, pressing a coin into the boy's hand. "Better head home before the snow starts up again." Tommy nodded, jamming his cap back on. "Yes, sir, Mr. Boone, ma'am." He collected his own horse from behind the barn, and was soon just a dark speck moving across the white valley. Noel led Susan to the cabin door, pausing with his hand on the latch. "It ain't much," he said gruffly, "but it's solid and warm." The interior was plain, but well-ordered. A heavy table of rough-hewn pine dominated one end of the single room, accompanied by 2 sturdy chairs. An iron cookstove gleamed against the far wall, its pipe disappearing into the stone chimney. Shelves lined with tools, cooking implements, and a few books ran along one wall. At the other end of the room, patched quilts had been strung on a rope to create a private sleeping area. Susan moved slowly into the space, taking in every detail. Despite its simplicity, or perhaps because of it, the cabin felt honest, real. The wooden floor had been swept clean, though ashes had scattered near the hearth. A stack of split logs waited beside the stove, and dried herbs hung from the rafters. This was a place where work was done, meals were cooked, and life was lived. While Noel went to tend to his horse, Susan found herself drawn to small tasks around the cabin. She located a worn broom in the corner and began sweeping up the scattered ashes. The rhythmic motion was soothing, giving her hands something useful to do while her mind processed all the changes the last day had brought. She gathered the spilled kindling into a neat pile by the stove, straightened the quilts hanging from the rope, and found herself humming softly as she worked. The cabin's simplicity made it easy to see what needed doing. By the time Noel returned, stamping snow from his boots, she had the place looking considerably tidier. "You didn't have to do that," he said, looking around. "I wanted to," Susan replied simply. It was true. The familiar motions of housekeeping had helped settle her nerves, making this strange place feel a bit more like somewhere she might belong. Noel nodded. "Need to check the fences before dark," he said. "Make sure the snow hasn't brought any down." "You'll be all right here." "Yes," Susan assured him. "I can get supper started if you'd like." Something softened in Noel's expression. "That'd be kind of you." He paused at the door. "Should be back before sundown. Got some rabbits in the snares to collect, too." Susan watched through the window as his broad figure moved across the snow, checking the fence lines methodically. The afternoon light was starting to fade when he finally returned, carrying 3 plump rabbits already cleaned and ready for the pot. She had found vegetables in the root cellar, potatoes, carrots, and onions, and soon had a hearty stew simmering on the stove. The cabin filled with warmth and savory smells as darkness gathered outside. Noel lit the oil lamp, its gentle glow creating a cozy circle of light around the table. They ate in comfortable silence until the stew was nearly gone. Then Noel cleared his throat. "Been alone up here a long time," he said slowly, staring into his bowl. "Had a wife once. Sarah. She..." His voice roughened. "She died in childbirth 7 years back, lost them both." Susan's heart ached at the pain in his voice. "I'm so sorry," she said softly. "Swore after that I'd never risk loving again." He looked up then, meeting her eyes across the table. Figured it was safer being alone. But a man can get mighty tired of his own company. The lamplight flickered over his scarred face, highlighting the vulnerability in his expression. Susan found herself wanting to reach across the table to offer some comfort, but kept her hands folded in her lap. "Miss Susan," Noel said carefully, "I want you to know something. You're free to leave if you choose. I'll arrange safe passage to wherever you want to go, give you money to start fresh. But if you stay..." He gestured at the cabin around them. "This place is as much yours as mine." "The deed I showed in town. I meant what I said about making you co-owner. Would be a proper partnership." Susan's heart thundered in her chest. The offer was more generous than anything she dared hope for, yet it frightened her too. Not because of Noel, no. In the short time she'd known him, he'd shown more kindness than she'd experienced in years. What frightened her was the possibility of belonging somewhere, of being valued, only to lose it all again. She nodded silently, unable to find words to express the tumult of emotions inside her. Rising from the table, she moved to the window. Fresh snow was beginning to fall, white flakes swirling in the darkness beyond the glass. The lamp's glow reflected in the window, and she could see her own face superimposed on the night, no longer the worthless burden her father had named her, but perhaps something new, something yet to be discovered. Bowing her head, Susan offered up a silent prayer, for guidance, for courage, and for the strange spark of hope that had taken root in her heart. Behind her, she heard Noel quietly clearing the table, giving her the space to wrestle with her thoughts as the snow continued falling in the darkness beyond. The days settled into a gentle rhythm at the cabin, each sunrise bringing new purpose. Susan rose early, stoking the iron stove until it glowed cherry red against the morning chill. She found comfort in the simple tasks that filled her hours. Threading needles, pressing seams, making the cabin more of a home with each passing day. One morning, she discovered a pile of Noel's work shirts tucked away in a chest, their elbows worn thin and cuffs fraying. Without a word, she began mending them, her practiced stitches neat and strong. The familiar motion of a needle and thread soothed her soul, and she found herself humming hymns from her childhood. Amazing Grace. What a friend we have in Jesus. Soft melodies that filled the cabin with gentle sound. Outside, Noel's axe rang steady against wood, the rhythm of his work matching her songs. Sometimes the chopping would pause, and she'd glimpse him through the window, standing still, head cocked as if listening. The thought that he might enjoy her singing brought a warm flush to her cheeks. The quilting frame Noel brought up from the root cellar was sturdy, if dusty. Susan cleaned it carefully before setting up her first project, a simple 9-patch pattern in blues and browns, practical colors that reminded her of the winter sky and forest. As she stitched, she watched Noel through the window, hauling water from the creek, the muscles in his back bunching beneath his wool shirt as he worked. He moved with purpose, every action deliberate and sure. The fence line needed attention after the heavy snows. Susan watched from the doorway as Noel tested each post, replacing those that had rotted or cracked. His huge hands, so capable of destruction, showed surprising gentleness as he tamped earth around the new posts, ensuring they would stand firm against spring storms. On the third afternoon, Susan stood at the window watching Noel check his trapline. The way he moved across the snow on his wooden snowshoes fascinated her, so sure-footed despite his size. Making up her mind, she bundled up in her warmest clothes and stepped outside. "Teach me," she called out, her breath clouding in the crisp air. Noel turned, surprise evident on his weathered face. "Ain't easy walking in these." "I know." Susan lifted her chin. "But I want to learn. Need to pull my weight around here." A ghost of a smile touched Noel's lips as he helped her strap on the spare pair of snowshoes. They were too big for her, but she was determined. Her first steps were awkward, and she nearly fell twice, but Noel's steady hand caught her elbow each time. "Wider stance," he instructed quietly. "Let the shoe do the work. Don't fight it." Susan nodded, concentrating fiercely. By the time they reached the first trap, she was moving more confidently, though still far from graceful. The trap held a plump rabbit, which Noel quickly and humanely dispatched. "You're doing well," he said as they continued along the line. "Most folks give up after the first fall." "Well," Susan replied, carefully picking her way across a drift, "I reckon there's plenty of things worth doing that ain't easy." That evening, as they sat down to rabbit stew and fresh bread, Susan's cheeks were still flushed from the cold air and exercise. "Thank you," she said suddenly, breaking their comfortable silence. Noel looked up from his bowl. "For what?" "For treating me like I'm capable. Like I can learn and do things." She stirred her stew, gathering courage. "My father always said I was useless. Too big, too clumsy, not worth feeding." "Your father," Noel said slowly, his voice rough with anger, "was a fool who couldn't see past his own nose." He set down his spoon. "You got strength in you, Miss Susan. The kind most folks overlook because they're too busy judging what's on the outside." Susan blinked back tears touched by his words. After supper, while Noel cleaned his rifle by the fire, she took out the small, leather-bound journal she'd brought from her old life. It was one of the few possessions she'd managed to keep hidden from her father's drinking money. By lamplight, she wrote of her fears, that this new life was too good to last, that she'd wake to find it all a dream. But she also wrote of gratitude, for the quiet man who saw worth in her when others saw only burden. The scratch of her pen and the soft click of Noel's rifle parts filled the cabin with peaceful sounds. Outside, the wind whispered through pine boughs heavy with snow. Susan was just closing her journal when a frantic pounding at the door shattered the evening calm. Noel was on his feet instantly, rifle ready. "Who's there?" "Please," a young voice called out. "Please help." Susan recognized the voice. "It's Tommy," she said, moving toward the door. When they opened it, Tommy stood gasping in the snow, his face red from running. "Mr. Boone, Miss Susan, it's my sister Emily. She's burning up with fever, and Ma can't break it. Pa's away in town and we don't know what to do." Susan was already moving, gathering supplies. She filled a basket with clean cloths, herbs from her drying rack, and a jar of honey for tea. "How long has she been sick?" she asked, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "Since yesterday, but it got real bad tonight," Tommy replied, shifting anxiously from foot to foot. Noel had disappeared outside. They heard him moving in the barn, and moments later, the jingle of harness announced he was hitching up the horse to the sledge. "We'll get there faster by sledge than horse alone in this snow," he explained, helping Susan up onto the wooden seat. He wrapped a heavy buffalo robe around her before taking up the reins. The night wind howled around them as they set off, Tommy riding behind them on his own horse. Their lantern swayed, casting wild shadows across the snow. Susan clutched her basket of supplies, praying they wouldn't be too late to help. She'd learned some healing from her grandmother, herbs for fever, poultices for chest complaints, knowledge her father had scorned as useless woman's work. The sledge runners whispered over the snow as Noel guided them steadily through the darkness. Every so often he glanced at Susan, noting her determined expression. This woman who'd entered his life like a storm was proving to have layers of strength he hadn't expected. He'd thought to rescue her, but perhaps she'd end up doing some rescuing of her own. Tommy's family's cabin appeared ahead, a single light burning in the window. As they drew closer, they could hear a child's weak coughing carried on the wind. Susan straightened her shoulders, ready to face whatever waited inside. She hadn't asked for this test, but she would meet it with all the courage she possessed. The lantern light swayed one final time as Noel brought the sledge to a stop. Sarah's hand was already on the door latch, her heart pounding with equal measures of fear and determination. Whatever the night might bring, she would face it, knowing at last that she was neither useless nor alone. The sled runners creaked through fresh snow as they approached the Murphy homestead. Even in darkness, Susan could make out the small shack's outline against the star-filled sky. A single lantern burned in the window, its light weak against the vast night. Tommy leaped from the sled before it fully stopped. "Ma! Pa! We brought help." The door swung open, spilling yellow light onto the packed snow. Mrs. Murphy stood in the doorway, her thin frame trembling. "Oh, thank the Lord you've come. Sarah's burning something fierce." Susan gathered her supplies, following Mrs. Murphy into the cramped interior. The air inside hung thick and close, heavy with fear. Mr. Murphy stood against the far wall, his weathered face drawn with worry. Both parents kept their distance from the small bed where their daughter lay thrashing. "The fever," Mrs. Murphy whispered. "We're feared it might be catching." Susan moved forward without hesitation, setting her bundles on a rough-hewn table. "First things needed is fresh air," she said firmly. "Tommy, open that window a crack. Mr. Murphy, sir, if you could help Noel bring in more wood for the stove, we'll need steady heat through the night." The men nodded, grateful for direction. Susan heard Noel's heavy footsteps crunching through snow outside, followed by the rhythmic thunk of his axe. Sarah lay small and pale against dark blankets, her face flushed with fever. Her nightdress clung to her with sweat, dark curls plastered to her forehead. Susan placed a gentle hand on the child's brow, feeling the frightening heat there. "How long has she been like this?" Susan asked, already unpacking her herbs. "Started yesterday with complaints of being cold," Mrs. Murphy replied. "By sunset today, she was burning up, talking nonsense about butterflies in the snow." Susan nodded, measuring dried yarrow into a cup. "Mrs. Murphy, could you heat some water? We'll need it for tea and compresses both." While the kettle heated, Susan soaked clean cloths in melted snow. She bathed Sarah's face and neck, speaking softly as the girl tossed restlessly. "There now, little one. We'll have you feeling better soon." The door opened, letting in a blast of cold air as Noel and Mr. Murphy carried in armloads of split wood. They stacked it quietly by the stove, where the fire had already begun to fade. Noel rebuilt it skillfully, soon having flames crackling strong and steady. "The tea's ready," Mrs. Murphy announced, hands shaking as she poured steaming water over Susan's herbs. "Let it steep strong," Susan instructed, "then we'll add honey if you have any. Makes it easier for little ones to take." Hours crept by like molasses in winter. Susan kept steady vigil, replacing cool compresses as they warmed, coaxing sips of medicinal tea between Sarah's cracked lips. When the girl grew restless, Susan sang softly, hymns her mother had taught her, the same ones that had echoed through the cabin that morning. "Amazing grace, how sweet the sound," she crooned, voice low and soothing. "That saved a wretch like me." The familiar words seemed to calm Sarah. Her thrashing eased, though her breathing remained quick and shallow. Susan stroked the girl's hair, praying silently for healing. Noel maintained the fire through the night, his presence a steady comfort in the small space. The Murphys eventually dozed in chairs, exhaustion winning over worry. Only Susan and Noel remained awake, watching over their charge as stars wheeled overhead outside the window. Near dawn, Sarah's fever finally broke. The change came gradually, her skin growing less hot, her breathing deeper and more regular. Susan felt the girl's forehead and smiled. "The worst has passed," she whispered. "She's seen no As if to confirm these words, Sarah's eyes fluttered open, clear and focused for the first time in hours. "Mama?" she called softly. Mrs. Murphy jerked awake, rushing to her daughter's side. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she gathered Sarah's small hand in hers. "I'm here, my love. How do you feel?" "Thirsty," Sarah replied, "and hungry too." Susan helped the girl sip some broth while Mrs. Murphy wept quietly, whispering prayers of gratitude. "You've saved her," she said to Susan. "The Lord sent you to us tonight. I'm certain of it." Mr. Murphy nodded solemnly. "We won't forget this kindness, Miss May." As the sun rose, painting the snow in pink and gold, Susan and Noel prepared to leave. Word had already begun spreading. Tommy had run to tell his aunt at first light, and she'd sent her husband to inform other neighbors. By the time the sled was ready, 3 other families had stopped by to check on Sarah and catch a glimpse of the woman who'd tended her through the night. The ride home was quiet, both Susan and Noel lost in thought as the horses plowed through fresh-fallen snow. Finally, Noel spoke, his voice rough with emotion. "Been years since I prayed proper," he admitted. "Not since losing Martha. But watching you tonight, hearing those hymns..." He paused, searching for words. "Reckon you stirred something in me I thought was long dead." Susan felt warmth bloom in her chest despite her exhaustion. "The Lord never stops listening," she said softly, "even when we fall silent." They reached the cabin as morning light filled the valley. Susan's legs trembled with fatigue as she climbed down from the sled. "I should start breakfast," she said, but Noel shook his head. "Rest first," he insisted. "I've got something to fetch anyway." Susan was too tired to argue. She had just settled into the chair by the stove when Noel returned, his hands full of delicate white flowers, their stems rimed with frost. "Found these growing under a snow crust," he said gruffly, laying them on the table without ceremony. "Thought you might like them." Susan touched the frozen petals gently, wonder replacing exhaustion in her eyes. She took out her journal, carefully pressing the flowers between its pages. Each bloom would dry there, preserving this moment when her heart felt too full for words. "Thank you," she whispered, though whether to Noel or to God she wasn't quite sure. The morning sun streamed through the cabin's window, catching the frost on the flowers and turning them to diamonds. Susan watched the light dance across their petals, marveling at how much could change in a single night. Word spread quickly through the scattered homesteads. By Sunday morning, when Susan and Noel made their way to the small wooden church, whispers followed them up the snow-packed path. Susan felt her stomach tighten as familiar faces turned to watch their approach. She clutched her worn Bible closer, drawing comfort from its familiar weight. The church bell rang clear in the crisp morning air, calling the faithful to worship. Noel's steady presence beside her gave Susan courage as they climbed the steps. He held the door, letting her enter first into the warmth of the sanctuary. Inside, the usual morning chatter dimmed as they found seats near the back. Susan heard fragments of whispered conversations. "That's her, the one who saved Sarah Murphy. The fat one from the auction. Heard she prayed all night. Never would have thought." Susan kept her eyes fixed forward, though her cheeks burned. The wooden pew creaked as Noel settled beside her, his broad shoulders creating a buffer between her and the stairs. The familiar scent of pine smoke and leather from his Sunday coat wrapped around her like a shield. Pastor Collins stood at the simple pulpit, arranging his Bible and notes. His weathered face creased into a gentle smile as he surveyed his congregation. When his eyes fell on Susan and Noel, he nodded warmly. The service began with familiar hymns. Susan sang softly at first, then with growing confidence as other voices joined in harmony. She noticed Mrs. Murphy and her family slip into a pew near the front, Sarah looking pink-cheeked and healthy again. The sight made Susan's heart lift with quiet joy. After the singing, Pastor Collins stepped forward to make announcements. His clear voice carried to the rafters. Before we begin today's message, I want to acknowledge God's grace shown through one of our own this week. Susan felt her pulse quicken. Noel's hand found hers rough and warm against her fingers. Miss Susan May, the pastor continued, through her faith and dedication became the Lord's instrument of healing for young Sarah Murphy. In a time when many might have feared contagion, she showed the courage of true Christian charity. Heads turned toward Susan again, but this time the looks held something different: respect, even admiration. Mrs. Murphy dabbed at her eyes with a handkerchief. "Let us pray together," Pastor Collins said, bowing his head. "Lord, we thank you for showing your mercy through Susan's hands. Bless her service to others, and may her example inspire us all to greater works of compassion in Jesus' name. Amen." "Amen," the congregation echoed. Susan blinked back tears, overwhelmed by this public acknowledgement. Never in her life had she been held up as an example of anything good. The rest of the service passed in a blur. Susan barely heard the sermon, her mind full of competing emotions: gratitude, disbelief, and a growing sense of her own worth that felt both wonderful and frightening. After the final hymn, people lingered to share news and greetings as they always did. But today was different. Instead of being ignored or avoided, Susan found herself surrounded by well-wishers. "Thank you for helping my Sarah," Mrs. Murphy said, embracing her. "God sent you to us that night, I'm certain." "You have healing hands," Bjorn, another woman added. "My Henry's got a cough. Might you know something that would help?" Even those who had sneered at her size now nodded respectfully as they passed. A few still whispered behind their hands, but their words held no power to wound her as they once had. The walk home stretched before them, the packed snow of the church path giving way to deeper drifts. Susan and Noel walked in comfortable silence for a while, their breaths making clouds in the cold air. The sun hung low in the winter sky, casting long blue shadows across the snow. Finally, Susan spoke. She paused, gathering her thoughts. "No one's ever praised me before. Not like that." Noel was quiet for several steps, considering his words carefully as he always did. "You ain't your father's possession no more," he said at last. "Never should have been treated as such. You're a woman of your own worth, Susan May. Been trying to show you that since the day we met." Susan's heart swelled at his words. They walked on, the crunch of their boots in the snow marking time with her thoughts. By the time they reached the cabin, the sun was setting, painting the sky in strips of pink and gold. Inside, Susan busied herself preparing their Sunday supper: venison stew that had simmered all morning before church, cornbread still warm from the morning's baking. The familiar tasks helped settle her emotions into something she could better understand. As they sat down to eat, Susan looked across the table at Noel. His face was thoughtful in the lamplight, and something in her chest tightened with affection for this quiet man who had changed her life so completely. "Thank you," she said softly. Noel looked up, questioning. "For bringing me into dignity," she explained. "For seeing worth in me when no one else did." Noel's expression softened. To Susan's surprise, he bowed his head. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "Lord," he began, the words coming slowly as if remembered from long ago. "Thank you for bringing Susan to this home. Thank you for showing me that love ain't finished with me yet. Help me be worthy of the trust you've placed in my hands. Amen." Susan's eyes filled with tears. She knew what this moment meant. The first prayer he'd spoken aloud since losing his wife. Another wall coming down between them. Another step toward healing. They ate in peaceful quiet, the stew warming them against the gathering cold outside. Through the window, Susan watched snow begin to fall, fat flakes drifting past the lamplight. Later, as Noel banked the fire for the night, Susan sat at the small desk where she kept her journal. By candlelight, she opened to a fresh page and wrote, "For the first time I feel wanted. Not as a possession or a burden, but as myself. The Lord has brought me from shame to dignity, from mockery to respect. And Noel." She paused, pen hovering over the paper as she searched for the words to capture the growing warmth in her heart. "Noel sees me as God does, worthy of love and capable of giving it." She closed the journal carefully, tucking it away in its drawer. The candle flame danced as she blew it out, leaving only the red glow of the banked fire to light the cabin. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in silence and possibility. In the darkness, Susan listened to Noel's steady breathing from his pallet near the stove. Her heart stirred with affection for this man who had saved her in more ways than one, not just from her father's cruelty, but from believing herself unworthy of love. She pulled her quilt closer, its familiar weight comforting. The events of the day settled in her mind like the snow outside, transforming everything they touched into something new and clean and full of promise. The January morning dawned bitter cold, frost painting delicate patterns across the cabin's window panes. Noel rose before sunrise as usual, stoking the dying embers in the stove and adding fresh logs. The familiar crackle and pop of the fire filled the quiet cabin as Susan stirred beneath her quilts, drawn from sleep by the sounds of Noel's morning routine. He pulled on his heavy coat and stepped outside to check the livestock, his boots crunching in the fresh powder. The sky stretched pale gray above, promising more snow. As he made his way toward the northern fence line, something caught his eye. Unfamiliar impressions in the snow that shouldn't have been there. Noel's weathered face creased into a frown as he knelt to examine the tracks. Multiple sets of boot prints, too neat to be trappers or hunters, led toward his property line. His heart sank as he recognized the purposeful pattern of surveyors' paths. Back at the cabin, he found Susan at the stove, stirring a pot of morning porridge. Steam rose from 2 tin cups of coffee on the rough-hewn table. She looked up as he entered, her smile fading when she saw his expression. "Something wrong?" she asked, ladling the porridge into bowls. Noel removed his coat, shaking off snow. "Found tracks up north. Reckon we ought to ride out and have a look." He paused, meeting her concerned gaze. "Railroad men, most likely." Susan's hands stilled on the ladle. They both knew what that could mean. The railroad had been pressing their claim on several properties in the territory, forcing settlers off land they'd worked for years. "I'll come with you," she said firmly, already reaching for her heavy shawl. They ate quickly, the porridge warming them against the chill. Susan wrapped bread and cheese in a cloth, tucking it into Noel's saddlebag along with a flask of coffee. Outside, their breath clouded in the frigid air as they saddled the horses. The ride north was silent, both lost in their own thoughts. Susan had grown comfortable on horseback over the past months, and she kept pace easily with Noel as they followed the fence line. Fresh snow had partially filled the tracks, but they remained visible enough to follow. Near the property boundary, Noel reined his horse to a stop. Susan drew up beside him, following his gaze to several wooden stakes hammered into the frozen ground. Red cloth strips tied to their tops fluttered in the winter wind, survey markers. Noel dismounted, his movements stiff with anger. He examined the nearest stake, reading the numbers carved into its side. A curse escaped through clenched teeth. "What is it?" Susan asked, though she already knew. "Railroads marking their claim," he growled. "These stakes show where they mean to put their track." He gestured across the snow-covered field. "Right through the heart of my land." Susan's chest tightened. "Can they do that? Just take it?" "They'll try." Noel's scarred face was grim. "Got friends in high places, the railroad does. Money to buy judges, papers that say whatever they want them to say." He spat into the snow. "Don't make it right, though." Dark clouds were gathering on the horizon as they continued their inspection of the property line. They found more stakes every few hundred yards, marking an uncompromising path across Noel's carefully tended fields and pastures. The wind picked up, driving loose snow across their path. Susan pulled her wool scarf tighter, shivering despite her layers. "Storm's coming," she observed. Noel nodded, eyeing the approaching weather. "We'd best head back." They had covered less than half the distance home when the storm hit in full force. The wind howled across the open ground, driving snow so thick they could barely see 20 feet ahead. Their horses struggled against the gale, heads lowered against the stinging ice. "There's a ledge ahead," Noel shouted over the wind. "We can wait it out." He led them to a rocky outcropping that provided some shelter from the worst of the storm. They dismounted, leading the horses into the lee of the rock face. Noel helped Susan down, his strong hands steady at her waist. The ledge created a shallow cave just deep enough for them to huddle out of the wind. Noel spread his coat on the ground for them to sit on, and Susan pulled out the bread and coffee they'd packed. They shared the simple meal in silence, watching the snow swirl past their refuge. "I'm scared, Noel," Susan finally admitted, her voice barely audible above the storm. "If they take your land..." She swallowed hard. "This is the only real home I've ever known. The only place I've felt..." She trailed off, unable to find words for all this place meant to her. Noel's rough hand found hers, engulfing it in warmth. "This is your home now," he said firmly. "Has been since the day I brought you here. I aim to fight for it, through the courts if I can, with my bare hands if I must." Susan turned to look at him, studying the strong profile she'd come to know so well. The scars that marked his face, the stubborn set of his jaw, the gentleness that lived in his eyes despite all life had dealt him. Something shifted in her heart, a feeling she'd been afraid to name taking clear shape at last. "We'll fight together," she said softly. His hand tightened on hers, and they sat in comfortable silence as the storm raged on. The horses stamped and snorted occasionally, but seemed content enough in their shelter. Susan found herself leaning slightly against Noel's solid warmth, drawing comfort from his presence. The worst of the squall passed after about an hour, though snow continued to fall steadily. They mounted up again, Noel helping Susan into her saddle with careful hands. The ride home was slow, their horses picking their way through fresh drifts. Night had fallen by the time they reached the cabin, the windows glowing with welcome lamplight. They took care of the horses first, making sure they were warm and fed in the stable. Inside, they hung their snow-covered outer clothes near the stove to dry. Susan built up the fire while Noel brought in more wood. Soon the cabin was filled with warmth and the rich smell of coffee brewing. They sat in their usual places by the hearth, hands wrapped around steaming cups. "What will you do?" Susan asked quietly. Noel stared into the flames. "Send word to the lawyer in town first thing tomorrow. See what legal standing we have." He sighed heavily. "Won't be easy. Railroads got more money than God and twice the influence." "But this is your land," Susan protested. "You worked it, built on it?" "Sometimes ain't about what's right," he cut in gently. "It's about who's got the power to take what they want." Susan's throat tightened as she looked around the cabin, at the quilts she'd sewn hanging on the walls, the herbs she'd dried tied in neat bundles from the rafters, the Bible on the shelf where they read together in the evenings. Every corner held evidence of the life they'd built here. She watched Noel's face in the firelight, seeing the worry etched in the lines around his eyes despite his attempt to hide it. This proud, private man who had given her sanctuary when she needed it most, who had treated her with unfailing respect and kindness, who had shown her what it meant to be valued, to belong somewhere. The realization that had been growing in her heart these past months crystallized into certainty. She loved him. Not just for saving her from her father's cruelty, not just for giving her a home, but for the man he was, scarred and sometimes broken, but deeply good, unfailingly gentle with her despite his fierce strength. The knowledge settled in her chest like a warm coal, bringing both joy and fear. Joy in the rightness of it, fear that this precious thing they'd found might be taken from them by forces beyond their control. "We'll find a way," she said firmly, reaching across to touch his hand. "Whatever comes, we'll face it together." Noel's fingers curled around hers, rough and warm. Outside, snow continued to fall in the darkness, but here by the fire, they had warmth and hope, and each other. For now, it would have to be enough. Dawn broke cold and gray over the homestead. Susan had just finished setting fresh biscuits on the table when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Noel rose from his chair, hand instinctively moving toward his rifle. A sharp knock rattled the door. "Boone, you there?" Noel recognized the voice of Tom Wheeler, their nearest neighbor 2 miles down the valley. He opened the door to find Tom astride his bay mare, breath steaming in the morning air. "Trouble brewing in town," Tom said without preamble. His weathered face was creased with concern. "Saw a bunch of railroad surveyors gathering at the hotel last night. Deputies with them, too, carrying what looked like legal papers." Susan moved to stand beside Noel in the doorway, her heart beginning to race. "What kind of papers?" "Don't know for certain," Tom replied, shifting in his saddle. "But there's talk they mean to contest Noel's deed. Railroad agents been buying drinks, loosening tongues. Thought you ought to know." Noel's jaw tightened. "Much obliged for the warning, Tom." After Tom rode away, Susan turned to Noel. "We need to go into town. Find out what's really happening." Noel studied her face. "I might get ugly. You sure you want to come?" "This is my home too now," she said firmly. "I need to know what we're facing." He nodded slowly. "Reckon you're right. We'll take the wagon. Roads'll be too slushy for riding." They prepared quickly. Susan packed bread and cold meat while Noel hitched the team. The morning was warming enough to turn the snow to heavy slush, making the going slow. The wagon wheels cut deep ruts in the mess of mud and melting ice. Susan sat close to Noel on the wagon seat, drawing comfort from his solid presence. They spoke little during the journey, each lost in their own thoughts. The sun was already dropping toward the western peaks by the time they reached town. Main Street was busier than usual for early evening. Clusters of men gathered outside the hotel and telegraph office, their voices carrying on the cold air. Several well-dressed strangers, railroad men, Susan guessed, stood smoking expensive cigars near the hotel steps. Noel drove past them without a glance, stopping the wagon near the saloon where most of the local men gathered. "Wait here a minute," he told Susan, but she shook her head. "I'm coming with you." Inside, the saloon was thick with tobacco smoke and loud conversation. Several heads turned as they entered. Susan's stomach clenched when she spotted her father among the men at the bar, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His face twisted into a familiar sneer when he saw her. They found seats at an empty table near the back where they could hear the conversations around them. A group of men at the next table were talking loudly, clearly meant to be overheard. "That deed ain't worth the paper it's written on," one said, tapping his glass for emphasis. "Everyone knows old Jenkins was taking bribes back when he was land agent. Half the deeds he signed were crooked as a dog's hind leg." "Shame if someone was fool enough to buy land from him," another added with a pointed laugh, "especially if they built themselves a nice cabin on it." Susan's father's voice cut through the noise. "Serves him right for taking what wasn't his to claim." He turned on his stool to face their table, malice gleaming in his bloodshot eyes. "That land was never yours, and now my fat daughter will earn her place." The words struck Susan like physical blows. She had known her father was a cruel man, but to side with those who would steal their home, it was a betrayal that cut deep. Noel's hand found hers under the table, squeezing gently. His voice when he spoke was deadly quiet. "A man ought to think careful before he talks about things that ain't his concern." "Ain't my concern?" Her father's laugh was ugly. "That worthless girl is my flesh and blood. Ought to have beaten more sense into her before letting her run off with a squatter." Several men tensed, expecting violence, but Noel remained still. Only the muscle working in his jaw betrayed his anger. "Come on, Susan," he said softly. "We've heard enough." Outside, the cold air hit Susan's face like a slap, and the tears she'd been holding back spilled over. She stumbled, and Noel's strong arm steadied her. "How could he?" she whispered. "His own daughter." "Some men ain't worthy of being called father," Noel said grimly, helping her into the wagon. "We'll fight this proper through the courts. Truth's still truth, no matter how many lies they try to bury it under." The sun had set completely now, and the temperature was dropping fast. Noel clicked to the horses, but instead of heading home, he turned down the side street toward the church. Martha Wesley offered us a bed if we needed it, he explained. Her cabin's just outside town. Might be best to stay the night, start fresh in the morning. Martha, a widow who sang in the church choir, welcomed them warmly. Her small cabin was clean and warm, with quilts that reminded Susan of home. Over a simple supper of beans and cornbread, Martha assured them that many in town still supported them. "Don't you worry about those railroad men," she said firmly. "The Lord sees what's right, even when men try to twist it wrong." Later, lying on a straw tick in Martha's spare room, Susan could hear Noel's steady breathing from his bedroll near the door. Despite the day's bitter revelations, she found comfort in his presence, in knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. Sleep was slow in coming. Susan's mind kept returning to her father's cruel words, to the memory of his satisfied smirk as he sided with those who would take their home. Yet beneath the pain of his betrayal, she found a surprising strength. The man who had spent years grinding down her spirit no longer held power over her. She had found her true worth. In Noel's respect, in the home they shared, in the life they were building together. Outside, an owl called softly in the darkness. The sound reminded her of nights at the cabin, of peace and belonging. Whatever happened with the railroad's claims, she knew now that home wasn't just a place. It was wherever she and Noel faced life together. Martha's spare room was cold, but the quilts were thick and warm. Susan pulled them closer, listening to Noel's quiet breathing and the familiar creaks of a cabin settling in the night. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for now, they had shelter, friendship, and hope. It would have to be enough. The first pale light of dawn crept through Martha Wesley's cabin windows, painting gray shadows across the rough-hewn floorboards. Susan stirred from her fitful sleep at the sound of hoofbeats approaching outside. Through the frost-glazed glass, she made out the familiar silhouette of Deputy James Rowe dismounting from his horse. Noel was already up, pulling on his boots by the dying embers of the hearth. He exchanged a meaningful glance with Susan before moving to answer the quiet knock at the door. The deputy stood on the threshold, his badge catching the early morning light. He held his hat in his hands, never a good sign. His face was drawn with concern as he nodded a greeting. "Mind if I come in?" he asked quietly. "Got something needs discussing." Martha emerged from her bedroom, wrapping a shawl around her shoulders. "I'll put some coffee on," she offered, moving to stoke the fire. Deputy Rowe stepped inside, stamping snow from his boots. His eyes fell on Susan, and something like regret crossed his weathered features. He waited until Martha had poured coffee for everyone before speaking. "Wish I was bringing better news," he began, warming his hands around the tin cup. "Railroads filed formal charges. They're claiming your deed's fraudulent, Noel. Unless you clear off the land peaceful-like, they aim to have you arrested." The deputy's words fell heavy in the quiet cabin. Susan's hand found Noel's arm, gripping it tight. "How long?" Noel's voice was steady, though Susan felt the tension in his muscles. "Till end of week," Rowe replied. "After that, I'll have no choice but to bring you in." Susan stepped forward, her chin lifted. "He's done nothing wrong. That land is rightfully his." "Ma'am, I don't disagree." The deputy set his coffee down carefully. "Truth is, something about this whole business doesn't sit right with me. But until someone can prove those charges false, I'm bound by law to enforce them." Noel's large hand covered Susan's where it still gripped his arm. "What kind of proof would it take?" "Records showing Jenkins was acting proper when he sold you the land. Witnesses who can speak to the sale being legitimate." Rowe shook his head. "But Jenkins is long dead, and most folks from those days have moved on." Martha spoke up from where she stood by the stove. Surely the Lord wouldn't have brought these two together just to see them torn apart by railroad men's greed. The deputy shifted uncomfortably. "I respect faith, Mrs. Wesley, but the law deals in paper and ink, not providence." Susan felt Noel's fingers tighten around hers. When he spoke, his voice was low, meant for her alone. "Maybe I should give myself up. Save you from being ruined along with me." "No," the word burst from Susan with surprising force. Everyone in the cabin turned to look at her. "I won't leave you," she continued, meeting Noel's eyes. "Not now, not ever. If hardship comes, we'll face it together." The deputy cleared his throat. "I've seen what railroad companies can do to folks who stand in their way. It ain't pretty." He stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll delay as long as I can, but you've got till week's end to either clear out or find proof that deed's genuine." After Roe had gone, Martha busied herself with breakfast preparations, giving them space to talk. Susan and Noel sat close together at the small table, their coffee growing cold between them. "You heard the deputy?" Noel said finally. "Railroad's got the law on their side. No sense in both of us going down." Susan's hand shot out, gripping his rough fingers. "God didn't bring us together for us to quit at the first storm." "This is more than just a storm, Susan. This is everything I built, everything I promised you, being torn away." "You promised me a home," she said firmly, "and home isn't just land and walls. It's us, together, facing whatever comes." Noel's eyes, usually so steady, showed a glimmer of moisture. "I can't bear to see you suffer because of me. And I won't stand by while you sacrifice yourself to spare me." Susan's voice softened. "Remember what you told me that first night? That I'm worth more than anyone ever saw?" He nodded slowly. "Well, you're worth fighting for too," she continued. "We'll pray on it. Together." Martha had quietly slipped into her bedroom, leaving them alone in the main room. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the cabin's windows. Susan tugged gently on Noel's hand. "Kneel with me." For a moment he hesitated. Then slowly he lowered himself beside her on the rough floorboards. Susan bowed her head, her voice quiet, but clear in the morning stillness. "Lord, we come before you with heavy hearts," she began, "but we know you are mighty enough to move mountains, and wise enough to guide us through valleys. Show us the way forward. Give us strength to stand firm in faith and wisdom to see your hand at work." She felt Noel's fingers tighten around hers as she prayed. Then, to her surprise, his deep voice joined hers. "Lord," he said roughly, "I ain't been much for praying since Sarah died. Felt like you'd turned your back on me. But Susan, she showed me different. Showed me there's still good in this world, still reason to hope. Help us find a way to keep this home you've given us, and thank you for bringing her to me." Susan's heart swelled at his words. Opening her eyes, she saw tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. Without speaking, she reached up to brush them away. Through the cabin window, the dawn sky had cleared, revealing stars still visible in the pale light. They shone bright and steady, despite the storm clouds gathering on the horizon, like promises waiting to be kept. Martha's quiet footsteps returned to the main room. "Breakfast is ready when you are," she said softly, "and after, we can start planning how to save your home." Susan rose from her knees, helping Noel to his feet. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and she saw in them not defeat, but determination. Whatever came next, they would face it together, strengthened by their first shared prayer and the love that had brought them to this moment. The morning light grew stronger, chasing shadows from the cabin's corners. Outside, the wind still howled, but inside, hope had taken root. Susan thought of their own cabin, waiting in the pines, and knew with sudden certainty that God had not finished writing their story. As they moved to join Martha at the table, Noel's hand found the small of Susan's back, a gesture of protection, of partnership, of promise. The touch said what words could not, that together they would find a way through this storm, guided by faith and bound by love stronger than any railroad's claim. Dawnlight filtered through frost-covered windows as Susan moved quietly around Martha's cabin. She pulled on her warmest coat and grabbed Noel's spare scarf from where it hung by the door. Her mind was set on what needed to be done. Noel stirred from his bedroll near the fireplace. "Where are you headed so early?" "To saddle your horse," Susan replied, wrapping the scarf around her neck. "We need to ride to the reservation today." Noel sat up, his brow furrowed. "The reservation? What for?" "To speak with Elder Nan Tan." Susan's voice held firm conviction. "You told me once how you helped their people during a harsh winter, brought them food and blankets when their children were starving." "That was years ago," Noel said, running a hand through his beard. "Can't expect folks to remember one act of kindness after so long." Susan paused at the door. "The Apache people have long memories, especially for those who showed them respect when others wouldn't. And right now, we need all the help we can get." Noel stood slowly, joints creaking in the morning chill. It's a long ride through deep snow. Might not even find the elder willing to see us. Then we'll have lost nothing but a day's ride. Susan's chin lifted stubbornly. But if he remembers you, if he can help us prove our claim. She left the sentence hanging. Martha emerged from her bedroom, wrapped in her shawl. The girl's right, Noel. Sometimes the Lord works through unexpected channels. I'll pack you some food for the journey. Outside, Susan trudged through knee-deep snow to the barn. Her hands, though chilled, worked steadily at preparing Noel's horse. She had learned the proper way to cinch a saddle in the months since coming to live with him, and took pride in doing it right. Noel appeared in the barn doorway carrying their packed supplies. "You're getting mighty comfortable giving orders," he said, but there was a hint of admiration in his voice. "Only when I know I'm right," Susan replied, checking the stirrup leather one final time. "And I am right about this. I can feel it in my bones." The morning air bit sharp and clean as they mounted up, Susan seated behind Noel. Martha stood in her doorway, one hand raised in blessing as they rode out. The horses' hooves broke through crusty snow, setting a steady rhythm as they headed east toward the reservation. Hours passed in relative silence, broken only by the creak of leather, and the horses labored breathing as they climbed higher into the foothills. Snow fell in lazy spirals, catching on Susan's eyelashes. She pressed closer to Noel's broad back for warmth, grateful for the solid presence of him. By mid-afternoon, the snow had deepened considerably. Noel guided them carefully along a ridge trail, the horse picking its way between snow-laden pines. Susan's legs had grown numb from cold and the constant motion of riding. "Getting close now?" Noel said over his shoulder. "Smoke rising ahead means we're near the agency building." Susan peered around him, seeing thin wisps of gray against the white sky. Her heart beat faster, hoping their long journey would prove worthwhile. The reservation sprawled across a protected valley. Simple wooden buildings clustered near the agency house. As they approached, Susan saw women in warm blankets moving between dwellings, children playing in the snow, and men gathered near cook fires. Noel dismounted first, helping Susan down with gentle hands. Her legs trembled as she found her footing in the deep snow. Together, they walked toward the agency building, leading the tired horse. Before they reached it, a tall figure emerged from a nearby dwelling. Elder Nantan moved with deliberate grace despite his advanced years, his dark eyes sharp as he studied the approaching visitors. Susan felt Noel stiffen beside her, uncertain of his welcome. The elder spoke first, his voice carrying clearly in the winter air. "Noel Boone, many winters have passed since you brought food to our hungry children." Noel ducked his head respectfully. "Didn't expect you to remember that, elder. We remember those who show kindness when others show only contempt." Nantan's gaze shifted to Susan. "And now you bring a wife?" "Susan may," she said, bowing slightly as she'd seen others do. "We've come seeking your counsel, elder, if you're willing to give it." Nantan gestured toward the agency building. "Come inside out of the snow. Tell me what brings you so far from your homestead in such weather." Inside, a pot of coffee simmered on the iron stove. The agency clerk, a young man with wire-rimmed spectacles, looked up briefly from his paperwork before returning to his tasks. Susan waited until they were seated, warming their hands around tin cups of coffee before explaining their situation. She told of the railroad's false claims, the threat of arrest, and their desperate need for proof that Noel's deed was legitimate. The elder listened without interruption, his weathered face giving nothing away. When Susan finished speaking, silence filled the room save for the crack and pop of burning wood in the stove. Finally, Nantan turned to the clerk. "Bring me the treaty map from 2 summers ago, the one marking the original land grants." The young man nodded, rising to search through a stack of rolled papers in the corner. He returned with a large map, carefully spreading it across the desk. Elder Nantan's finger traced along the ridge where Noel's cabin stood. This land was never given to the railroad. The treaty lines are clear. Everything north of Bear Creek remained open for homestead claims. Your deed would have been registered before any railroad surveys were made. Hope bloomed in Susan's chest. "Would you be willing to testify to this, elder? To speak before the law about these boundaries?" Nantan's dark eyes met hers steadily. "I will speak truth as I have always done. But be warned, railroad men do not easily surrender what they wish to take. They will fight harder when they know they are wrong. Noel leaned forward, studying the map. This proof, it's enough to stop them from arresting me? It should be, the elder replied. But I have seen how white man's law can bend when money pushes against it. You will need courage to stand firm. Susan's hand found Noel's, squeezing gently. We have courage, and we have truth on our side. Nantan nodded slowly. Then I will ride to town tomorrow, bring this map and my testimony. It is right that old debts be repaid, and that justice be done. We're much obliged, Noel said roughly, emotion making his voice heavy. Never thought that one winter's kindness would come back to save everything I hold dear. The elder's face softened slightly. The Creator's ways are not always clear to us, but nothing done in love is ever wasted. He turned to Susan. You have chosen a good man, despite what others may say. His heart has always been true. Susan blinked back tears, touched by the simple dignity of the elder's words. I know, she said softly. That's why I'll fight beside him, no matter what comes. Outside, the winter day was fading toward dusk. Nantan insisted they stay the night rather than risk the dangerous ride home in darkness. A warm meal was shared, and simple pallets arranged near the agency's fire. As Susan drifted toward sleep, she heard Noel and the elder speaking quietly in the darkness. Their words carried the weight of remembered kindness, of promises kept, of justice that moved slow but sure as the changing seasons. Her last thought before sleep claimed her was a prayer of gratitude for the man beside her, for the help they'd found, and for the hope that now lit their path forward. The journey home from the reservation felt lighter somehow, despite the biting cold and deepening snow. Susan held the precious treaty map close beneath her coat, wrapped carefully in oilcloth to protect it from the weather. Noel guided their horse along familiar trails, following the setting sun westward toward their cabin. The Lord does provide, Susan murmured, her breath frosting in the winter air. Who would have thought salvation would come through such unexpected means? Noel nodded, his broad shoulders blocking much of the wind from reaching her. Reckon I never thought that venison I shared years back would save our home. They reached the cabin just as darkness settled over the ridge. Smoke still curled from the chimney. Their neighbor Martha had kept the fire burning in their absence. Inside, warmth and the smell of bean soup welcomed them home. After seeing to the horse, they settled at the rough-hewn table. Susan carefully spread the treaty map across its surface, smoothing the weathered paper with reverent hands. Noel lit extra candles, their golden light illuminating the careful lines and markings that proved their claim. We should make a copy of the important parts, Susan said, reaching for her journal, just in case anything happens to the original. She worked diligently, her handwriting neat and precise as she recorded Elder Nantan's testimony word for word. The scratch of her pen and the crack of the fire were the only sounds for nearly an hour. Noel watched her work, amazed at how her face glowed with purpose. When she finished writing, Noel rose and went to the corner where his rifle stood. He took it down, checking the mechanism with practiced hands. The metal gleamed in the candlelight as he began to clean it. Susan looked up from her journal, her face troubled. Noel, she said softly, we can't win this fight with bullets. His hands stilled on the rifle. Sometimes a man has to defend what's his. But that's not God's way, she insisted, rising to stand beside him. We have truth on our side now. Real proof. If we resort to violence, we'll lose everything. The moral high ground, the respect of our neighbors, maybe even our freedom. Noel's jaw worked as he considered her words. Finally, he nodded slowly and set the rifle back in its corner. You're right. Been too long relying on just myself and my gun. Reckon there's better ways to fight. Instead of the rifle, he took up his tools, checking edges, sharpening what needed it. Still best to be prepared, he said. Fence might need mending. Wood needs splitting. Work keeps a man steady when trouble's brewing. Susan smiled, understanding his need to keep his hands busy. She returned to the table, reviewing her notes and practicing how she would present their case. Her voice grew stronger as she spoke the words aloud, gaining confidence with each repetition. The treaty map clearly shows that all land north of Bear Creek remained open for homestead claims, she declared. Elder Nantan's testimony confirms that no railroad grants were ever made in this territory. Noel's deed was properly registered years before any survey teams arrived. Noel paused in his work, watching her. "You sound like a proper lawyer," he said with quiet pride. "I sound like someone defending her home," Susan corrected him. "Our home." A knock at the door interrupted them. Martha stood outside with several other neighbors, the Hendersons from the next valley over, old Jim Tucker who ran the grist mill, and young Thomas whose sister Susan had nursed through fever. "Heard you were back," Martha said as they crowded into the warm cabin. "Word spread about tomorrow's town meeting, railroads gathering their forces." "So are we," Susan replied, gesturing to the treaty map. The neighbors gathered around, studying the evidence with careful attention. Jim Tucker cleared his throat. "Railroad men won't take kindly to being proved wrong, but I reckon I could stand with you tomorrow. My voice still carries some weight in town." "We'll come too," Sarah Henderson said, her husband nodding beside her. "About time someone stood up to their bullying ways." Young Thomas stepped forward, his face earnest. "Miss Susan saved my sister's life. Least I can do is bear witness to her character, if it comes to that." Noel watched in amazement as more neighbors pledged their support. These were people who had once mocked Susan, who had kept their distance from him. Now they gathered close, offering strength for the coming battle. Later, after the neighbors had gone home through the snowy night, Susan sat by the fire writing in her journal. Noel pulled his chair close to hers, the warmth of the flames washing over them both. "Never thought I'd see the day," he said quietly. "All those folks standing with us." "Oh, it's not me they're standing with," Susan replied, looking up from her writing. "It's what's right. They're tired of being pushed around by men who think money matters more than truth." "Still," Noel said, "I never expected." He trailed off, struggling with the words. "After Caroline died, I swore I'd never lean on anyone again. Thought being alone was safer." Susan reached over and took his rough hand in hers. "God often uses the weak to confound the mighty," she said softly. "Says so right here in my Bible. When I came here, everyone thought I was worthless, too big, too plain, only fit to be sold off by my father. But God had other plans." "You're the strongest person I know," Noel said, his voice rough with emotion. "Don't know what I'd do without you now." "We're stronger together," Susan replied. "That's how God meant it to be. No one should have to stand alone." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the fire dance. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing their ridge in white. Tomorrow would bring its challenges, but tonight they had warmth, truth, and each other. Susan's journal lay open on her lap, filled with carefully copied testimony and prayers for guidance. Noel's tools gleamed, ready for honest work rather than violence. And in both their hearts, faith burned steady as a winter star, lighting the path ahead. The night deepened around their cabin, but inside, hope glowed warm as the banked fire. Susan's last entry in her journal read simply, "With God's help, truth will prevail. We are ready." The morning sun cast long shadows through the church's frosted windows as townspeople stamped snow from their boots, filling the wooden pews. Their breath clouded in the cold air, despite the pot-bellied stove crackling in the corner. Susan stood near the back, clutching her journal and the precious treaty map, while Noel's solid presence beside her gave her strength. Railroad Agent Trumbull swept in wearing a fine wool coat, followed by two assistants carrying leather document cases. They commandeered the front table, spreading papers across its surface with flourishes meant to impress. Susan's father slouched on a bench nearby, a flask visible in his coat pocket despite the early hour. Deputy Rowe positioned himself near the pulpit, his badge catching the winter light. "Folks," he called out, bringing the murmuring crowd to order. "We're here to settle the matter of land claims north of Bear Creek, specifically the homestead currently occupied by Noel Boone." Trumbull stepped forward, his polished boots clicking on the wooden floor. "The railroad's position is clear," he announced, holding up a sheaf of documents. "Our survey teams have confirmed that this land falls within the federal grant given to the railroad for expansion. Any private claims are null and void." The crowd shifted uneasily. Several farmers muttered. They'd heard similar claims about other properties. Susan felt neighbors' eyes upon her, some sympathetic, others doubtful. Her hands trembled as she held the treaty map, but she remembered the words she'd practiced so carefully. "Mr. Boone," Deputy Rowe said, "do you wish to contest this claim?" Before Noel could speak, Susan stepped forward. Her skirts rustled in the sudden silence as she moved toward the pulpit. She heard someone snicker, probably one of the railroad men, but kept her head high. "I would like to present evidence," she said, her voice clear despite her racing heart. Carefully, she unfolded the treaty map on the pulpit. The aged paper crackled as she smoothed it flat. "And who might you be to present anything?" Trumbull asked with barely concealed disdain. "I am Susan May, co-owner of the disputed homestead," she replied, meeting his gaze steadily. "And this map, certified by the Federal Indian Agency, shows the true boundaries of settlement lands north of Bear Creek." Her father lurched to his feet. "You ain't got no right to speak here," he shouted, face flushed. "You're just property I sold fair and square." "Order," Deputy Rowe commanded sharply. "The lady has every right to speak regarding her property." Susan's hand steadied as she began to read from the map. According to the Treaty of 1864, all lands north of Bear Creek and east of Thunder Ridge were designated as open territory for homestead claims, with no railroad grants permitted in this region. Her voice grew stronger as she continued. The treaty specifically states that these boundaries were set to protect both settler and tribal interests from corporate expansion. A murmur rippled through the crowd. Trumbull's face darkened. "That's obviously a forgery," he declared. "Where would someone like you get an official treaty map?" "From me." The voice came from the back of the church. Elder Nantan rose slowly from his bench, his weathered face dignified in the morning light. The crowd parted as he walked forward, his moccasins silent on the wooden floor. "I remember when this treaty was signed," the elder said, his English clear and measured. "I was there when the boundaries were drawn. Every word the woman speaks is true." He pointed to specific markings on the map. "These are the symbols my father helped draw, showing the sacred lands that were to remain free from the Iron Horse." Trumbull's face had gone from red to white. "This is preposterous. You can't expect us to take the word of a dash." "Choose your next words carefully," Deputy Rowe interrupted, his hand resting meaningfully on his badge. "Elder Nantan's testimony carries full legal weight in this territory." The deputy stepped closer to examine the map. Susan held her breath as he studied the markings, compared them to the railroad's documents, and consulted a small book of regulations he carried. After what seemed like hours, he straightened. "The treaty map is genuine," he declared. "Its boundaries are legally binding and supersede any later railroad claims. Mr. Boone's homestead deed, being properly registered within these boundaries, is therefore valid and uncontestable." Gasps and exclamations filled the church. Trumbull sputtered, trying to object, but his assistants were already gathering their papers, seeing the fight was lost. Susan's father slumped in his seat, the flask falling from his coat to clatter on the floor. "Furthermore," the deputy continued, "any attempts to seize or survey this land without proper authority will be considered trespassing and dealt with accordingly." He fixed Trumbull with a stern look. "I suggest you inform your superiors of the situation." Susan felt lightheaded with relief as Noel's strong hand found hers. "You are braver than I ever was," he whispered, his voice rough with emotion. Neighbors began crowding around them, Martha with tears in her eyes, the Hendersons offering congratulations, young Thomas grinning broadly. Even some who had once mocked Susan now nodded respectfully as they passed. Elder Nantan approached them last. "You have honored the truth," he said simply. "May your home always know peace." He touched his hand to his heart, then turned and walked silently from the church. The morning sun had risen higher, streaming through the windows in bright shafts that seemed to Susan like arrows of divine light. She clutched her journal, where she had copied every word of testimony, every prayer for strength. The treaty map was carefully folded away, its truth now known to all. Noel's hand remained warm in hers as they prepared to leave the church. Their home was safe, their future secure, not through violence or deceit, but through courage and truth, just as God had intended. "Shall we go home?" Noel asked softly. Susan smiled, remembering the lonely cabin that had become so much more. "Yes," she replied. "Let's go home." Together they walked toward the church doors, their neighbors' voices warm around them, the winter sun bright on new fallen snow. The morning bell tolled once more, its clear note ringing across the valley like a declaration of victory. The townspeople filed out of the church into the crisp winter air, their usual chatter replaced by thoughtful silence. Steam rose from their breath in the cold as they gathered in a half-circle before the church steps. Snow crunched beneath their boots as they shifted, waiting. One by one, the men removed their hats. First came old Tom Henderson, raising his worn cavalry hat in Susan's direction. Then Marcus Webb, the smithy, dipped his soot-stained cap. Soon every man stood bareheaded in the morning light, offering the quiet gesture of respect. Pastor Collins stepped forward, his weathered face gentle as he took Susan's hand between his own. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, his voice carrying in the stillness. "May his blessing rest upon you both." Susan felt tears prick her eyes at the formal blessing she'd never thought to receive. Noel stood straight and tall beside her, his massive frame casting a long shadow across the churned snow. His voice, usually so quiet, rang out clear and strong. "I chose her once. I choose her still." He turned to face Susan, his scarred face softened with emotion. "Not for what she looks like, but because she is the strongest woman I ever knew." The tears Susan had been holding back spilled over. Around them, the crowd bowed their heads, acknowledging the truth and power of his words. Even those who had once mocked her size now stood in respectful silence. Near the back of the crowd, her father swayed on his feet. The flask had fallen from his nerveless fingers into the snow, and his face was gray with shame. Without a word, he turned and staggered away, a broken man carrying the weight of his cruelty. As the sun began its slow descent, Susan and Noel made their way home to their cabin. The familiar walls welcomed them, and the iron stove still held warmth from the morning's fire. They added fresh logs, watching the flames catch and grow. Exhausted but triumphant, they settled into their chairs by the hearth. Susan's journal lay open on her lap, but she had no words to write. Instead, she reached for Noel's hand. His calloused fingers wrapped around hers, strong and gentle. They sat in quiet joy, watching the fire dance. They had won their land, yes, but they had gained something far more precious. In standing together, in choosing each other again before all, they had claimed their dignity. The warmth of that victory glowed brighter than any flame. 3 days after their triumph at the town meeting, the little church glowed with warmth against the winter morning. Neighbors filled every rough-hewn pew, their Sunday best brushed clean for the occasion. Candlelight danced from brass holders along the walls, casting soft shadows that seemed to pulse with each breath of the congregation. Susan stood in the church's tiny back room, smoothing her plain cotton dress with trembling hands. She had sewn it herself, adding tiny stitched flowers around the collar. Nothing fancy, but made with care and hope. Her reflection in the clouded mirror showed cheeks flushed with joy, her heavy figure wrapped in simple dignity. Through the door, she heard the murmur of gathering voices, then the first notes of "Amazing Grace" rising from Mrs. Henderson's piano. The familiar hymn wrapped around her heart like a warm shawl. Taking a deep breath, she stepped into the doorway. Noel waited at the front, his massive frame somehow gentled by his clean shirt and combed hair. The scar that crossed his cheek caught the candlelight, but his eyes held steady, fixed on her with quiet wonder. Pastor Collins stood ready with his Bible, his weathered face creased in a paternal smile. As Susan walked slowly down the narrow aisle, she glimpsed movement in the back pew. Her father sat there, shoulders hunched, head bowed low. His hands twisted his hat brim, and tears tracked down his weathered cheeks. He couldn't raise his eyes to meet hers, but neither could he stay away from this moment of grace. Reaching Noel's side, Susan turned to face the congregation. Her voice, though trembling, rose clear and true as she sang, "Great is thy faithfulness." The hymn spoke of mercy renewed each morning, of God's unchanging love. As she sang, several women dabbed at their eyes with handkerchiefs. Pastor Collins spoke of redemption, of how love could heal the deepest wounds and bridge the widest gaps. He reminded them that marriage was a holy covenant, blessed by God and witnessed by community. His words fell like gentle rain on thirsty ground. When the time came for vows, Noel's large hands engulfed Susan's smaller ones. Their promises rang with sincerity, to love, honor, and cherish, in plenty or want, in joy or sorrow, as long as they both should live. Each word carried the weight of truth, earned through trial and triumph. "Amen," called out old Tom Henderson as the vows concluded. "Amen" echoed through the church, growing stronger with each voice that joined. The congregation's blessing wrapped around the couple like a warm embrace. As Pastor Collins pronounced them man and wife, the church bells began to ring. Outside, snow fell in lazy spirals, each flake catching the light from the windows. Inside, candlelight gleamed on smiling faces as the newest family in the settlement joined hands to face their future together. The afternoon sun had begun to set as Noel helped Susan onto their horse for the ride home. Her simple wedding dress caught the fading light, and wisps of snow swirled around them like nature's own wedding bells. They rode slowly through the deepening dusk, Susan nestled safely against Noel's chest, their shared warmth keeping the winter chill at bay. As they crested the final ridge, their cabin came into view. Golden lamplight spilled from its windows across the pristine snow, creating a welcoming beacon in the gathering darkness. Susan's heart swelled at the sight. This was no longer just Noel's refuge or her sanctuary from shame. It was truly their home. Noel lifted her down from the horse with gentle hands, his weathered face soft in the evening light. "Welcome home, Mrs. Boone," he said quietly, the words carrying all the weight of their journey together. Inside, the cabin glowed with warmth from the iron stove. Susan had laid out fresh bread earlier that morning, and a pot of celebratory stew had been slowly simmering all day, filling the air with rich aromas. They settled at the rough-hewn table, now made beautiful by a simple cloth and the dancing light of their lamp. Noel served the stew while Susan cut thick slices of bread. For a moment, they simply sat in peaceful silence, taking in the profound change that had come over their shared space. Every familiar object, the patched quilts, or the shelf of tools, the worn Bible on its stand, seemed transformed by their new bond as husband and wife. Susan reached for her leather-bound Bible, opening it carefully. From between its pages, she withdrew the pressed wildflowers Noel had given her that first night after she had helped save the neighbor's child. The petals were dried, but had retained their delicate beauty, like their own love that had bloomed against all odds. Tears welled in her eyes as she pressed the flowers permanently between the Bible's pages. "These were the first gift you ever gave me," she said softly. "The first time I felt truly seen." Noel reached across the table and lifted her hand to his lips. His voice was rough with emotion as he spoke. "You gave me back everything I thought was lost forever," he said. "Faith, when mine had died. Family, when I'd sworn never to risk love again. A true home, not just shelter from the storm." Outside, the weather seemed to hear his words. The swirling snow settled, and through the cabin's window, stars began to glimmer over the ridge. Their ridge now, legally and rightfully theirs, won through courage, truth, and faith. Susan rose and moved to Noel's side of the table. She rested her head against his shoulder, breathing in the familiar scent of pine and leather that clung to his clothes. "Thank you, Lord," she whispered, her prayer rising from a heart overflowing with gratitude. For second chances, for love that sees past surfaces, for bringing beauty from ashes. The cabin that had once echoed with Noel's solitary footsteps now hummed with shared life and purpose. Every corner seemed to radiate with the warmth of belonging, every shadow softened by the light of their joined lives. Where loneliness had dwelt, love now made its home. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.